Whenever immigration comes up in America, it seems like everyone immediately starts arguing past each other. One side talks about borders, the other side talks about compassion, maybe somebody else starts yelling about the Constitution, and before you know it, Thanksgiving dinner is over. But here's a question I don't think gets asked nearly enough. Are we accidentally lumping together two completely different issues, immigration versus citizenship? Because technically they're not the same thing. Think about it. Someone can legally live here, work here, own a business, raise a family, pay taxes, sign contracts, go to court, and enjoy legal protections without necessarily being a citizen. In other words, residency and citizenship have never been identical concepts. So why do we constantly treat them like they're inseparable? From a purely objective perspective, citizenship is fundamentally political. It's not primarily about whether someone can peacefully live their life. It's about participation in political institutions, most notably voting. Now, whether you agree with this or not, it's an interesting distinction. As a libertarian, I tend to think we should separate private life from political power whenever possible. If someone wants to come here, work hard, respect private property, voluntarily trade with others, produce instead of living off the government dole, and live peacefully, that's one conversation. Granting political authority through citizenship, however, is another. Those aren't automatically the same thing or the same decision. Here's where things become especially controversial. The Supreme Court, as we all know by now, or should, recently left in place the modern interpretation of birthright citizenship, meaning that children born on U.S. soil automatically receive citizenship. Now, there are plenty of people who believe that that settles the issue. But does it? The argument is actually the opposite, or should be the opposite, that automatic citizenship could make immigration debates even more politically charged because immigration stops being viewed simply as people moving across borders for work or family. And instead, every immigration debate also becomes a debate about future voters, future political coalitions, and future public, aka government-funded spending. Whether that's persuasive is something that each listener can decide for themselves, but it certainly explains why emotions run so high on this issue, even if people don't realize it. Now, here's another layer to consider. In purely objective and absolute terms, citizenship isn't really a natural right in the same way that, say, property rights are. Nobody homesteads citizenship. You can homestead land, you can own your labor, you can defend your life and property, but citizenship itself exists primarily because governments create legal categories for membership within political institutions. That is a very different kind of right. And historically, expanding citizenship has often gone hand in hand, unfortunately, with expanding the state itself. Now, before anyone misunderstands me, this isn't necessarily an argument against immigration. In fact, it's the opposite. It suggests that one can support relatively open movement of peaceful people while still believing citizenship should involve a separate, deliberate process based on long-term residency, productive contribution, and genuine connection to the American community. In other words, the debate isn't simply open borders versus closed borders. It's also about whether political membership should automatically follow physical presence. That is a much narrower and probably more productive question and conversation to have. Now back to birthright citizenship. Birthright citizenship raises the political stakes because government programs and voting rights become even more intertwined with immigration policy in the immigration question overall. Again, once citizenship is automatically granted in this manner, this birthright citizenship manner, every immigration dispute also becomes a dispute over future elections, future welfare obligations, and future taxpayer responsibilities, like I alluded to before. This creates incentives that simply wouldn't exist if our government were much smaller to begin with. Let's be honest. If government wasn't redistributing trillions of dollars every year, if politicians weren't constantly competing over benefits, subsidies, and regulatory favors, citizenship would probably be a much less explosive topic. Without today's welfare state providing such an enticing incentive for illegals to come here and live off the government's teat, as I covered in the previous episode, perhaps we'd be able to relax a little more on this issue and safely kick up our feet and assume that those coming here were coming to work, produce, and contribute, instead of assuming that they're coming here to be another burden on taxpayers. Politics becomes a high-stakes game precisely because government has accumulated so much power over our lives, in particular with the welfare state. And maybe that's the bigger lesson here. Too often we assume every social disagreement requires another federal policy. Maybe the opposite is true. Maybe the more power we centralize in Washington, the more every demographic change, every election, every court ruling, and every immigration debate becomes an all or nothing political battle. That isn't a recipe for peaceful coexistence. In fact, it's a recipe for permanent political warfare. As a libertarian, I keep coming back to the same basic principle. Separate peaceful private life from political power whenever possible. Protect property, protect contracts, protect individual rights, limit the ability of government to redistribute wealth and manipulate political outcomes. Because the less that our government has to hand out or take away from the taxpayers in the first place, the less incentive people have to fight endlessly over who gets to control it or get it. Maybe that's the real issue. Not simply who crosses the border, not simply who receives citizenship, but why political power has become so valuable that every question about membership in our society now feels like a winner-take-all struggle. If we want a more peaceful and less divided country, perhaps the long-term solution isn't just rethinking immigration policy. Perhaps it's the larger issue of reducing the size and scope of government itself so that citizenship carries fewer political spoils and individual liberty carries far more weight.